Good morning, everybody, and thank you for coming along today. Welcome to the offices of UNI. We're here this morning to talk about public-private partnership, better known as PPP, a subject that's both important and difficult. Important because without the skills and resources of the private sector, the public sector will be unable to develop the houses, offices, and critically, the communities that this country so desperately needs. Important because working in partnership is fundamental. At UNI, we firmly believe in the power of partnerships. No one person or organisation can have all the answers. Insight and experience must be shared to achieve the best outcomes. And important because if you're developing somewhere in partnership, not just with the local authority, but also with the local community, you're more likely to create a place that works for all those involved. Involving local people, rather than imposing a plan from a distant headquarters, is more likely to lead to something that delivers real value to an area. People want to have pride in where they live, and they want it to have an identity. After all, these are the people who have the greatest stake in the place doing well. But PPP is also a difficult subject. Difficult in part because it's often confused with its similar-sounding cousin, PFI, an altogether different way of the public and private sectors working together, and as the collapse of Carillion showed, not always a successful way. As a direct consequence, both the PFI and PPP brands have become tarnished. Polling we carried out earlier this year showed that while 56% of people thought that the private and public sector should work together to help address the housing crisis, that figure dropped to 45% when asked about using PPPs as the mechanism to develop public land. It's difficult, frankly, because some PPP projects have not gone as well as they should have, for all sorts of reasons. The problems around the Haringey development vehicle is but one recent and high-profile example. And difficult, often sadly, for reasons of ideology. A belief that it's only the state that can create things that deliver social value. Anything else must be tarnished by the stench of commerce. At UNI, we fundamentally believe the opposite. We believe that you can do good and do well at the same time. There need not be a trade-off between quality and profit. Indeed, our belief is that you can deliver socio-economic value, you're also more likely to generate economic value and the greatest commercial value. And so PPP is potentially a particularly effective way of delivering value for all. So how do we make PPP both more important and less difficult? Well, we're a curious bunch at UNI. We like going out and talking to people, so we did. We held roundtable events in Manchester, in London, and in Birmingham, with representatives from both the private and public sectors, as well as from civic society. We also conducted interviews, and from all this talking, we learnt a lot. We came to some conclusions about what makes for best practice in the public-private partnerships, and that's what we're here to talk about today in this report. We'll discuss in a moment the content of the report with a distinguished panel of representing the various sides of the debate and chaired by Heather Jameson from Municipal Journal. But I want to make it clear that today is not the end of the debate. It's just the start of a long and what might often be a difficult conversation that needs to go on over time. But it's an important start, and that's why I'm particularly pleased that we're joined today by the Minister for Local Government, Rishi Sunak MP, to help us open that debate. Rishi, thank you, and welcome to the panel.
Matthew, thank you. Good morning, everybody. Lovely to be with you here today. Not much going on in my world, so glad to be able to take the time. First of all, I very much welcome the work undertaken by UNA to highlight the value of PPPs. And as someone who spent a good chunk of their life in California, I very much appreciate people and institutions with a curious mind and an entrepreneurial spirit. And I think in UNI, we're really lucky to be here at the home of a thought leader in a sector. And I very much welcome that innovative and unique way of thinking. And the report, as I flicked through it, one thing that struck me was just the sheer range of people that have been engaged and consulted in the process. And I thought that was absolutely brilliant. And in general, the report, I think, is a very welcome contribution to the conversation about how we create excellent places that improve people's lives. As I touched on, my background before politics was in business and finance and investing. So I am a passionate and firm believer in the value of the private sector, in what many of you do, not just because often the public sector thinks, well, that's a good place to go and secure the capital that we need. But also I value the commercial expertise, that international knowledge, the technical skills, the cost discipline that you all can bring to particular projects. But having had this job as Minister for Local Government for the best part of this year, and seeing firsthand the work that our incredible local councillors up and down the country do, I also am a big believer in the power of local government. And speaking even as a constituency MP who attempts to try and do the same thing, I'm constantly struck by how close a connection local councillors have to their communities and the passion they have for representing them. And obviously, good PPPs have to harness the strengths of both the private and the public sector. It's absolutely critical that our communities have the ability to shape the developments that affect their day-to-day lives. And as the report, I think, absolutely rightly picks up, key to that is trust. And how do you build trust? Well, obviously, it starts with early engagement and then effective engagement and management throughout the life of a project. But it also starts with a shared vision that everyone's bought into. And indeed, transparency is absolutely key for maintaining that trust throughout the lifetime of a particular project. Now, like anything else in life, there are good and there are bad examples of PPP, and it's, as I think the report referred to PFI as the ugly cousin. You know, poorly framed contracts, of course, can result in distrust, and when projects collapse, you know, badly needed infrastructure doesn't get built or services don't get delivered, and that's obviously not in anyone's interest. But what I'm pleased to say is that there are also excellent examples up and down the country. King's Cross, what a landmark development, new public spaces, homes, offices, retail, educational facilities. The award-winning Clapham One development, so there's a library, there's a leisure centre, a medical centre at not a single penny cost to the public purse in Lambeth in association with high quality and affordable housing. And then up in the Midlands, the Solihull Partnership, over the last decade has delivered over £500 million of investment to build new and renew existing housing stock. It's built 7 new primary schools and 2 neighbourhood community centres. So what I want to see is that PPPs working successfully as a genuine partnership between local government, the public sector, and the private sector, with innovative and thoughtful companies like you and I at the vanguard. And those are the kinds of projects that I know will deliver incredibly positive benefits for the communities that I and everyone in government has the privilege to represent. What I'm delighted about is that this report will help ensure that we know how to deliver more of those kinds of projects. And I commend you and I for talking so passionately and rightly about the importance not just of financial returns, but also of social and community objectives when delivering those commercial projects. I'm incredibly excited to see what all of you do together to deliver for all of the communities up and down this country. Thank you very much indeed.
Minister, thank you for those supportive words. I know you don't have time for questions even before the news over the last 24 hours, but we look forward to working with you over the future and what is a nuanced debate, but I'm sure we can play a part, and we greatly appreciate your time today. Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks very much.
We're now going to move on to the panel, and Heather's going to lead us through this, and there's plenty of time for Q&A as part of that process. And do we have roving mics and stuff like that? Or yes, we do. So hands up and all of that.
Excellent. Okay, good morning, everybody. Thank you very much for coming, and thank you to you and I for letting me come and chair it today. I'm very pleased we managed to get through the ministerial speech without a resignation. Yeah. So,
you know about.
Well, he might be going back now, you know. I'd like to start by introducing the panel, and then we'll ask each of the panellists to say a few words by way of their own introduction before I'll kick in with some questions, and please feel free to give me a wave if anyone else has got questions too. So just to run through our panel, we have Matthew Taylor, who is Chief Executive of the Royal Society of Arts, Helen Goulden, who is Chief Executive of the Young Foundation, and Councillor Claire Coghill, who is leader of Waltham Forest Council, in addition to Matthew, who you've all heard already. So if we'd like to kick off with, I realise this is obviously a Me Too moment. We've got a very strong split between men and women. Matthew, do you want to start?
Yeah, thank you. So I've been kind of thinking about public-private partnerships for a long time. When I ran the think tank IPPR, we produced a major report called the Commission on Public-Private Partnerships, which was a very prescient piece of work. It argued there was no ideological problem about the private sector providing public services, but it also argued that a lot of public-private partnerships were badly put together, without a clear rationale, and we also said, much to the chagrin of Gordon Brown and John Prescott at the time, that PFI looked like it was highly problematic. So you're right, Matthew, that the kind of part of the challenge here is that capitalism is facing a crisis of legitimacy, and within that, public-private partnerships are facing a crisis of legitimacy, and it's hard for anybody to break out of that level of kind of public distrust and skepticism. Now, I thought your report is an excellent report, and I think the principles you outline are excellent, and the work that you have done, some of the schemes that you described, are great, and I've seen great regeneration schemes myself. I guess if I want to say something slightly provocative, it would be this: that in the context of that level of public skepticism, I think you don't just have to say good things, you don't just have to say what your principles are, you have to be clear about the fact that there are some things that are unacceptable and that still keep happening. And those things, I'm afraid, however good you are, have a bigger effect on the public perception. And so I'd identify two: profit gouging and excess pay. So the public's view is that if somebody is in any way getting money from the public sector, they should not be paying the senior people in that company millions of pounds in wages. And, we can have an argument about it, but I'm telling you, they don't like those headlines. They do not think that anyone getting taxpayers' money should be earning, ludicrous sums of money. Secondly, you don't mention at all in the report probably the single issue that in London certainly people would mention most often, which is developers reneging on the commitments they've made in relation to social housing. And if I was going to name a practice, so just imagine you're an ordinary member of the public, and I say to you, in this sector, in the regeneration sector, there are agencies that have been set up with the explicit purpose, and this is how they market themselves, of enabling developers to wriggle out of the commitments they've made to build social housing. That is how they advertise themselves. Pay us, and we will help you renegotiate the commitments that you made, having consulted the community.
Sure.
There is not a member of the public who would not feel that was totally unacceptable, but yet it does happen in this sector, and it is somehow accepted. So everything in the report was brilliant, but I'm afraid in the difficult worlds in which we live, you have to be willing to say certain things are completely unacceptable, as well as talking about all the great stuff that we ought to be doing.
Okay, thank you, Matthew. I actually was at the press briefing for that report, so that probably ages me quite a lot. But I would just say the one thing that my one takeaway from that report was that private sector companies were doing these sorts of deals every day, and local government were doing them once in a lifetime.
There's an imbalance of power. That's part of the story about people reneging on their commitments, I'm afraid.
Is it still, with the cuts to local government, is there anywhere near the capacity in local government, do you think, to be able to deal with these big projects?
That's why I think the report is right. The focus has got to be on the community, because if this is simply a transactional relationship between developers, the private sector and local authorities, then I'm afraid the local authorities who are strapped for cash and often don't have, particularly outside London, people of the kind of experience and calibre and self-confidence to be able to deal with big private sector partners. So the focus on the community is really important. But if you make a commitment to that community, you really need to live up to it. The one last thing I'd say is this. We're doing work at the RSA in my organisation. And I think one of the most disappointing things about public-private partnerships overall, I think much less so in regeneration actually, is the lack of innovation. Yeah. Because really what should be coming out of this partnership is innovation in public procurement, innovation in the way we do public services, and there's far too little of that. And that's really the big disappointment about contracting out. Contracting out has not been about innovation. I'm afraid, at all. So the thing we're thinking about is how could you reimagine, rethink public procurement, public commissioning, public-private partnerships in order to have a much more sophisticated whole system approach to innovation.
Okay, thank you. Helen, if we come to you next.
Hello, I'm Chief Executive of the Young Foundation. I echo lots of what Matthew has said, and particularly with regard to communities. So the Young Foundation has a mission to support stronger and more connected communities, and we use our research and our community development practitioners and our social investment directed towards that purpose. And perhaps drop it down slightly level in sort of agreeing with what Matthew says, but also sort of practically some very other kind of clear challenges, which are sort of a lack of capacity and skills across the board, really. So in developers and in local authorities, at the very time that you need more capacity, more tolerance and patience of working in communities about what they genuinely want and need, you've got the least capacity to do so. In terms of being a highly intelligent, with the best possible use of the word, client and partner in a PPP partnership, the hollowing out of skills within the local authority sort of landscape is pretty severe. And so in terms of, there isn't much innovation, I think, happening there. People like public practice, I think, thinking about rotating in different kinds of urban planning and design expertise into local authorities is at a start, but it's kind of tiny, really. And then, of course, you do have a capacity problem or challenge in communities as well. The confidence and the capability of a community to feel that it has any agency or control over what affects it is strong in some places, usually by quite an entrenched and militant and kind of already activist community, but in many others, it's weak and absent, and the need to support and engage and support the kind of development of confidence in those communities to think that they do have a role is also a job to be done. So across the board, while the kind of connection and the collaboration, all the potential is there, you also have a real set of gaps across the board that make for a weak partnership in some ways. And I think the final thing perhaps to say as well is that it strikes me that there is, I was really interested in the report when it talked about marrying well, when it talked about kind of the relationship between local authorities and developers. And I wondered how many local authorities or developers would characterise their relationship as an equal marriage full of love. It would be quite a difficult thing to find, possibly. And so it struck me, organisations like the RSA and others could do, or even the government, could do quite a lot to hold open some purposeful space, to have more grown-up conversations about the character and nature and type of those relationships that is somewhat depersonalised. So you can draw on all the kind of lived experience that you have and kind of perhaps the scars that you have, but in an environment where you can talk openly about some of the kind of real crunchy challenges and the trade-offs with communities, the trade-offs with public value, the trade-offs that a private sector company operating with a mission for social purpose will inevitably have to make and hold itself to account for.
Okay, we mentioned earlier about the Haringey development vehicle. And I realise in terms of, you probably don't want to go into specifics
Not
here,
really.
but is that the price of failure of engaging the public and getting people on board
I think
at
there's
an
a
early
whole
stage?
set of things happening there that are not just related to the community, I suspect. But you talk about political risk in the report as well, which I think the appetite and ideology that sits behind some of the decisions that get made, and actually the challenge of short-termism. The best will in the world, a property developer is coming on something that's probably got a 20 or 30 year perhaps horizon maybe, and a local authority is not working necessarily or able to work on those things. You've got a mismatch sometimes of expectations of how you can deliver in what time frame.
Okay, thank you. Claire, hi.
Thanks very much. This is a really fascinating topic, and I'm very, very pleased to have been invited today, so thank you very much indeed. Apologies if I'm a little weary. I'm jet-lagged, having just been to the States for the first time. And the last meeting that I did before I went to America for the first time was have a meeting with the Chinese embassy. So I feel like I've done the real full political and economic spectrum. The Chinese embassy came to see me because we flew the Tibetan flag outside the town hall, and I had a conversation with the political representative to China about a flag. So you've got control freakery and liberty and both ends of the political spectrum for me in the period of a past week. And why I mention that is because there is serious animated talk in my party, the Labour Party, about anti-capitalism. I was at a branch meeting, and someone who was fairly archetypal of Labour Party members at the moment, who was an older white man with a final salary pension, who owned his own home outright in the north of my borough. And he told me that he didn't believe in capitalism, i.e. capitalism should end. I said, oh, that's very interesting, and was on my best behaviour, and said, and what would you propose to replace it? Needless to say, answer came, there none. And I think there is this very strange situation where the social and political discourse is presenting to members of the public, particularly younger politicised members of the public, this fake utopia where you can get stuff done that doesn't involve money. And it does. It simply does. And if you're going to attack that in the way that the Haringey delivery vehicle was attacked, then you are going to have to propose something in its place. If people are reluctant to talk about the HTV because they're being diplomatic, I think that's marvellous, but I feel I need to be direct about it. People on the extreme left of my party went in and sought to disrupt a process that was designed to pull down and rebuild some of the worst social housing in this country. Accommodation that is an absolute disgrace, accommodation that very poor people on very low incomes longed to see torn down and replaced for them and their families. And I think that given the state of local government funding, if you add up everything that's been stripped out of my budget between 2010 and now, including losing £12 million a year, each year for Sure Start centres, that tots up to nearly £500 million. So there is serious money that's been stripped out of local authorities. The capability in most local authorities to negotiate good deals isn't there, but that doesn't mean to say it's not possible. If you've got the right politicians at the head of it and they're demonstrating the right political will, then it is absolutely possible. I think it's fascinating that this government in the budget abandoned PF2. I don't know if anybody saw that. There's been no PF2 since 2016 apparently, and then the final line said something like, but we'll be doing some bits for hospitals, don't you worry about it. Well, that's simply not going to deliver housing of any kind, it won't deliver social housing, and it will not deliver schools and school places. The Priority Schools Building Programme, which is supposed to have delivered thousands of new school places across the country and brand new schools, simply is not delivering. So what is the alternative? I think it needs to be an increasingly sophisticated conversation with the general public, led by political figures who are prepared to be more bold and more honest about the reality. Because telling people that they can have their cake and eat it is ridiculous. And it will frankly cause nothing but difficulties as we go ahead. I would also encourage the private sector to be bold. Talk about the jobs that you create. Talk about the pension funds that you have. Talk about the skills and training that you offer. Talk about the number of families that are supported by the companies that you run and that you work for. And I think that will take people with you far more than before. What we know in this political landscape is that if you try and bury your head in the sand, it will still get cut off. Thank you.
Thank you, Claire. Excellent round of applause too. Can I ask, do you think the housing crisis has made the public far more open to development and development in partnership, or do you think that the political environment has completely wrecked that?
It's a great question. And thank you for it. Weirdly, the housing crisis is making it harder to get stuff built, seemingly. There is this sort of axis of hard left activists and middle class people who are effectively NIMBYs. I was on a panel just before I went away, and it was somebody he was saying, you know, he was talking about terraced housing, you know, in London, and building more of it. What are you doing? You know, really? That's insane, isn't it? you know, on top of a tube station with a PTEL rating of 6A, you're proposing terraced housing. And as someone who studied English literature, so how I've ended up doing this, I still don't really know. But it seems to be working out all right, so I'll keep with it. The brilliant E.M. Forster book, Howard's End, at the end of that book, the people who've lived in bucolic wealth, who've had big, beautiful houses, describe at the very end of the novel this red mist appearing on the horizon, this terracotta dust appearing on the horizon. And that's working class people having a house, that is. And you fast forward to now, the resentment of ugly buildings. Well, if that's what housing associations can build with the money they've got, well, maybe you have to suck it up, you know. And if you have got tube stations, then you are going to look at tall buildings. And to pretend otherwise is just frankly ridiculous. So thank you for that question. You can see I enjoyed answering it.
Okay, I know the Housing Minister wrote in the MJ last week, I think, about we're all slimbies now, so it's something lovely in my backyard. So that's the latest thing. Matthew, I just wanted to ask, I think the report talks about sort of almost rebranding PPP and making it more acceptable. How do you propose the government and private sector go about doing, and local government try and go about doing that?
I think we use the word reset rather than rebrand because I think that's just giving it a different name is a bit lipstick and all of that. And I don't think it's the right. We have to be bold, and we have to. I think Claire summarised it. We have to be bold. The public sector have to be bold. What's interesting, I'm going to dumb down the level of English literature on this panel, but there's a book called Our Towns, and it's a 100,000-mile journey into the heart of America, and it's by a historian and a journalist and a husband and wife team, and they went to all of the towns in Middle America, so the flyover states, and looked at what made them successful. And what they found is when they asked people who got things done, I think it was quite interesting because it was a vicar, it was a head teacher, but you know what, it was actually occasionally a real estate developer. And so I think for us, we just have to stick to our commitments that we make and principles. And I think, the point Matthew made is right. Communities are right to be cynical about developers. The approach to public consultation has been woeful.
Absolutely.
And, to put up a board 3 days after you've actually submitted your planning application and say that's public consultation is not really the way that we would recommend that you go about this process. So I think you have to reset, take a step back, talk, and which is what we did, and then try and come forward with some commitments that at least by having some form of governance panel and scrutiny on what you're doing, by making it clear that there is an alignment of interest above. Yeah, I think most people accept that if you're going to take risk, you're entitled to a return. Question what that return is, but above that return, there should be a sharing with the local community of that success of the project. I think if you then also try and bring some funding to the wider community so that they can participate on a level playing field in that without wanting to be condescending, but to give them the experience and help to frame some of these projects, which are, as you said earlier, are very difficult in communities that haven't experienced change of that scale. If you help fund that as well, maybe you can have a dialogue that actually tries to reconcile the fact that there is a need and people accept that there's a need to use public land to deliver, but there's a huge amount of mistrust, and engagement is the only way we're going to do that. And I think, transparency and scrutiny is part of that process.
Yeah, I think dumbing down would have been Kim Kardashian's biography. So.
That makes my literary reference look better.
Yeah. Okay, so Matthew, with...
Which one?
Sorry, you.
Yeah, enough for me.
Yeah.
We shouldn't sit next to each other.
In my head, I knew who I was talking to. In terms of the Carillion, the PFI projects and all that kind of thing, has the private sector become a bit toxic?
Yeah, I mean, there's no question about that, and I think what Claire said was really interesting because I think the problem is this is a toxic brew of people with a very strong political agenda who dislike capitalism as a system, but unfortunately they are aided by actual existing capitalism behaving in ways which live up or live down to precisely that characterization. And I think that people like Claire, who are fighting an incredibly brave battle to focus on pragmatism, realism, and actually improving people's lives rather than striking postures. It's desperately difficult when you're doing that. And then, you know, I was reading in the Financial Times yesterday Sarah O'Connor's piece about the richest man in Britain, who's reportedly worth £21 billion, who is screwing in Tees Valley local authorities, Middlesbrough, the most deprived authority in the country, you know, basically screwing them to get as many, you know, millions of pounds in order to site his factory there, and saying, if you don't give me as much money as you've got, I'll go somewhere else. And you read that and you think, you know, how then those people who want to develop a balanced approach have to go to public meetings and, you know, Labour Party branch meetings, wherever it might be, and it's difficult, it's very difficult. So what do you do about that? Well, I've said one thing, which is I think, you know, as well as what you've put in your report, in the sector, you need to provide sector leadership. You know, the private sector is not very good, I don't think, at calling out bad practice in its midst. And, you know, and you need to do that. I remember years ago, when we did the work for IPPR, I went to a meeting at the CBI of the Public-Private Partnerships panel there. And I was kind of saying to them, the real issues are at PFI. And the room was divided into two groups. One group who said, what we need to do is a video of all the hospitals we've built. And the other one who said, no, actually, we need to say there are real problems at PFI and we've got to reform it and we've got to work with government to reform it. The first side won the argument. You know, the video was commissioned. And so, you know, there's a constant debate going on within every sector about, the, you know, whether or not people should face up to these challenges. Secondly, so I'd encourage you to be brave, Matthew, about saying what is acceptable and what's unacceptable, and about speaking out and saying when anyone in our sector behaves badly, it has a ramification for all of us and it makes the life of people like Claire much more difficult. Yeah. And then, secondly, in terms of internal scrutiny, so I was until 3 days ago on the internal review panel that DeepMind Health set up. And unfortunately that's gone now because DeepMind Health has been largely subsumed back into Google, which is another story. But what was very impressive about that was we were an entirely independent panel. We didn't sign non-disclosure agreements, and we, every year, wrote a report, we had authorship of it, about whether we felt the company was living up to the issues it should be, living up to its standards, and challenging the company to answer some questions we felt weren't fully answered. Now, it was a painful process, and actually it culminated in the summer in some really bad stories because we got, you know, poor communication. But I do think that initiative was brave, and I think that if you really want to demonstrate your credibility and your commitment, thinking about independent internal review processes, tough though they might be, is something that is worth considering. Because I've been on other panels that companies have set up and they've been basically toothless. But this was different, and it was painful because it was powerful, and there are lessons to be learned. But I would encourage companies also to say, okay, we will have independent people who we invite to hold us to account.
Do feel free to pitch in, audience. If anyone's got any questions, do just wave. Oh, we've got a couple here. Have we got the microphones? There's one there and then one at the front here. No.
Can you hear me? Yeah.
Yep.
James Lever from Knight Frank. Interesting just phase of discussion there about whether or not the private sector is toxic. We talked about the perfect marriage. Do we think that the procurement industry is set up to pimp, if you like, the perfect marriage?
Okay, and there's another question at the front here. Yeah.
Hi, I'm Russell Curtis from RCK Architects, and I'm a Mayor's Design Advocate. I have a question about, well, it's a comment, but a question also. A common failing of both PFI and PPP, I think, is the transfer of risk from the public to the private sector, and with risk comes reward. And I think partly the toxicity of the private sector is a result of big profits that come from taking those risks. So I wonder how we might encourage the public sector to take more risks, to be more entrepreneurial, and sometimes accept failure.
Oh, ever the question in local government: how do you take risks when you have political consequences of the? I'm going. You know it's coming to you.
Someone else has resigned, by the way. So Dominic's gone and Esther McVeigh's gone. Crikey, what's going on this morning? I could redo that in election. You know what I mean? It's like, it's loads of work. Oh.
I'm sure
Dominic's definitely resigned.
Yeah.
I'm sure your returning officer could do without an election as well. But,
I know, and they cost us about 100 grand each one, so they are expensive. Anyway, so I think the procurement question is massively important, not least of all because, you know, who really understands it? We've got amazing procurement people at my town hall, and, you know, we're doing everything that we can to keep them because they are that much in demand. But their abilities around negotiation, their pragmatism, I think that's, you know, it's an extraordinary achievement. I think there needs to be a far more sophisticated debate within local government generally. I think it would be really good to start that discussion probably with the Labour group of the LGA, which is led by Councillor Nick Forbes and the team led by Pete Robbins. That would be a really interesting space, and we have our conference to talk about those things. Don't call it procurement because councillors won't come, unfortunately. If you call it like social housing, then you'll definitely get loads of them. So that's one thing. And I think this issue around the transfer of risk, I think is absolutely fascinating because I think it just gets. I think you're so right to highlight it, and that's the origin of it all. And then that has sort of got lost over the years. That particular point. And I think in terms, so I reread the Labour Party manifesto in my summer holidays because I'm that sad, but I thought I really need to know this. I really need to understand where we are. And one of the key things is, and it is, you know, so let's take the renationalisation of rail as a starting point. People support that in large numbers across this country when you survey them, but what do they actually support? They want efficient trains that don't cost a lot of money. Well, that's what we tried before, and that didn't work out so well. So how do you get into a space where you're having a much more pragmatic discussion with people about the benefits that have been wrought by the private sector's involvement? And another one that's really popular is the renationalisation of the water industry, which, bear with me because I know it sounds boring, but it's really important, this example, which is the idea that the public sector will invest more than the private sector and will do better than the private sector. You can actually disprove that with what's happened in Northern Ireland, where water was never privatised and there has been no significant investment by national government in that infrastructure, and it has had, you know, no positive impact on costs being driven down. But these are key points that need to be talked about, you know, properly within local government circles and other sector circles for it to even begin to really get into the national debate around what we can actually afford and how best to spend the limited money we've got.
Okay, thank you. And I think water companies, again, are equally one of the companies that are, I think Matthew highlighted the amount of pay going to people who are effectively providing a public service. I think that's one of the difficulties we have with them.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
And also loading up on debt.
Yeah.
In some cases. I mean, I think in relation to this question of transfer risk, I think this, you know, the transparency thing is really important. And I think with patient capital, what you need in regeneration is patient capital, which, you know, because regeneration schemes are a pretty safe form of investment if they're well done, are guaranteed reasonable returns, and there needs to be, I mean, I think the best structure for these deals is an agreement that the profits that are generated beyond that need to be shared between investors and the community, and that needs to be, you know, that needs to be explicit. And you know, so I think that it's both about the transfer risk, but it's also about making sure that upside advantages are fairly and reasonably distributed. Because as much as the public is annoyed when the private sector hands the keys back when it can't make a profit, it's also annoyed when it sees people making monopoly, you know, making bumper profits.
I think as well, you suggested profit share within the report.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's a fundamental pillar of how this gets reset, is that there is transparency, there is a sharing, and it's not, and I think the local community needs to see the transparency that it goes to the public sector, and then it comes back to the local community. Otherwise, it is difficult. And I think just on the patient capital point, there is a change. We see institutional capital all the time. There's definitely a change that a mechanism that it's not all about financial return. When you've got Larry Fink as Chief Executive of Blackwell, the world's biggest investment management house, saying you've got to do well and you've got to do good, otherwise we're not going to invest in you as a company. That starts to frame a debate where companies will take it seriously, because if they haven't got the oxygen of capital, they can't fulfill their role. And I think that is encouraging. Now, 4 years ago, we'd have said do well, do good, and people looked at us a bit strangely. It's now sort of common investor parlance, and I think that is an encouraging journey that we're going on, that says actually you've got to, the word is inequality or trust, and I think capital is saying it can't see how it's going to earn its patient return unless it understands that there's a wider definition of what return is.
Yeah. Do we have any further questions from the floor? We've got one there. Any more?
Graham Tully from GL Hearn. Do you think we're entering more and more into the world of not just public-private, but public-public-public-private partnerships?
Man.
You can fill in the gaps if you like. And if we are, who's agreeing what with who in that relationship?
Helen, we haven't heard from you for a while.
Well, I take that.
Give Helen the really hard question.
I'm so sorry.
I will interpret it as you say, as the public being the general public, as well as you may not mean that.
For example, the local forest in partnership with the NHS needs the private sector.
Okay.
One estate.
Sorry?
One public estate.
Right. Okay, so perhaps more Claire, but I would sort of say that sort of some of the evidence now around particularly, well, of course, the built environment, so the social determinants of health. We know that housing is the single most sort of biggest determining factor of someone's health. We know it impacts educational attainment. We know that the way in which developments are designed massively impact whether different kinds of people bump into each other, know and respect each other. We know that we've lost hundreds and hundreds of public spaces where people, neutral places where people could come together and meet, not in shops, not in faith groups, but places where people can understand and respect each other, bump into each other essentially. And we know that many of our public and commercial services have systematically designed out human interaction in the name of efficiency, and we've taken that on board completely and enjoyed all of those efficiencies, but there is a consequential loss to basically communities and people not understanding each other well. So you take all those things together and then put on kind of, how do you build a great place to live, or how do you put your bricks and mortar together to create a great place? Then the property development becomes one of the single most important people, if you didn't already know it. And not doing anything in the service of those wider social challenges isn't a neutral act. It's a negative act of willful denial of some realities, of which, of course, we all bear the consequences of in years to come. And I think sort of people like, I'm not so familiar with the one cat, one estate stuff, but the way in which the Healthy New Towns work has been developing in terms of how do you build places where people can be genuinely healthy. There are some really good examples of that, some pretty not so good examples, but where you're actually bringing social mission and purpose into bricks and mortar in a very solid way, with the public and private sector and the community holding people to account for the long-term impact of that. I'm not sure that answers your question.
Okay, Claire, do you want to? It's all about people and places in local government, and this is a centre.
Yeah, absolutely. I think what Helen says is absolutely spot on, and I think it. You articulate brilliantly the thrust of what we're trying to do. Our example, our experience with One Public Estate is focused around Whipps Cross Hospital, which is unsurprisingly a partnership with the NHS. Us, the Corporation of London will be involved because some of their land is involved. I think it's, the Army, the MOD will be involved because part of their land is involved. And there is an extraordinary opportunity to do something incredibly special there, to provide housing, to provide new facilities. Whipps Cross Hospital has the longest hospital corridor of any hospital. And people talk about that looks like it's a good thing. It's like, we've also got massive wards. I'm not aware there's a ward. I lived in France, so I speak French. I don't think there's a word in French for ward, because they don't put people in corridors. Do you know what I mean? They have rooms, and that's much better, and that's the future, and that's what we want to head towards. But just as a tiny part of that, there are abandoned nurses buildings there that are 5 stories high and have been long abandoned. It looks like, I'm not exaggerating, the set of a horror film. And as soon as we said we want to rebuild this hospital so it provides, it's not, you know, a breeding ground for MRSA, it's a high quality, brand new facility where there will be transition for people from hospital back into the community, homes for key workers. There was a campaign started by a small group of local residents who started a campaign to protect these rotten nursing buildings. You know, how do we work with people who are saying no to anything? I hope to get some slimbies, but there are still plenty of NIMBYs about.
So Claire, I just want to reassure you, because I was a councillor in the 80s, and we embarked on a school closure programme, and that because we had some very small schools in rural areas, and then they had 12 kids in them, and you had to have 2 teachers, because one teacher falls ill, you have to have a second teacher. So the pupil-teacher ratio was incredibly good in these quite well-heeled areas. So we did close a couple of schools, and I remember going to one meeting with a school that had 8 pupils, and somehow there were 35 parents there, so I don't know how that worked. But one really brave parent, this is absolutely true story, one really brave parent got up and said, well, you know, maybe the council is right, and maybe the kids would have a richer curriculum if they went to a bigger school, because after all, things are a bit run down, and we do have rats in the school. And another parent got up, I've never forgotten it, and said, yeah, but we love our school rats.
Yeah.
But it then does become a question about, when you talk about engaging communities, who is the community? Because the loudest voices are not representative often of the broad populace.
Which is why another thing I would strongly encourage is the use of deliberative methodologies. So, you know, our democratic system is in a bad way, but all around the world there's really strong innovation in deliberative democracy, which is properly robust processes where you draw a representative sample of the population, you engage them in depth, in a solutions-based approach. And it works, and it works all around the world. Unfortunately, most consultation is not done like that. It is who turns up, it is who shouts loudest. Oppositional voices are you know, it's much more easy to articulate opposition than it is to engage with a difficult challenge. So using proper deliberative methodologies is something I would encourage.
May I add something, Heather? Just
Yes,
very briefly. It's really to thank Matthew for giving us this platform today, and generally you and I, who have been fantastic in my community and in my area. And the piece of work that was done at Black Horse was fantastic. You know, a meanwhile use which created a literal space where I had a platform with invited members of the community. And what did we stand on to give our speeches?
Crate,
it was like
milk crate.
A milk crate. I've not stood on a crate before, but it was effective. But that was a very strong message to the local community. It's also that type of activity that you and I showed such leadership on was an opportunity for me to then put pressure on others to do more of the same. But you and I did a fantastic favour to others who want to get stuff built in the area. We do need to see more of that stuff.
Okay, great. Matthew, I'm very aware that you need to leave, so what I think we should do now is say thank you to our panel in the usual way before we hand over to Matthew for a few final words. So thank you.
Thank you.
So clearly, if you host an event and you publish a report, you get to say some closing remarks. But actually, I'm not going to say any particularly because I think the quality of the debate said more than I could ever say. I would just say one thing. What I heard, and I think we hear a lot, is that civic trust is the glue that can bind all of this together. And without it, they fray and fall apart. And I think, you know, trust is clearly a broader societal issue. And we'd be fools to think that we in the development community can fix it on our own. But what we can do is to make sure that that glue is in place at the local level, where, you know, we are regenerating, we are creating, and we are engaging, and we are, you know, we've changed our meanwhile use to now worthwhile use for that matter, because I think meanwhile gave it the wrong context. And, you know, in places like Brighton, where we started with what was meanwhile use, the communities come together and they've carried it on outside our own scheme, which is an amazing sort of regeneration in a way. And we're not going to fix the reputation of PPP overnight. But maybe the commitments we've made in the report about community challenge panels, community profit shares and the community engagement fund can all help deliver better public-private partnerships and create more impact and more reward and, quite frankly, better places. That's not only going to help to improve the perception of PPP, but it's going to change people's lives for the better. So it just remains to me to thank all of those who took part in the consultation, which are too many to mention now, to thank you all for coming along this morning, to thank Rishi for being so supportive in his speech earlier, and to thank our panellists, Matthew, Claire and Helen, for providing such a stimulating debate. Thank you. There is tea and coffee afterwards. Some of us will be around to chat more, but feel free and thank you. Have a good morning.